In the fast-growing tech city of Lamora, the conference room inside the Cambial Systems headquarters was full of excitement. Cameras flashed, investors laughed, and champagne glasses clinked together. It was the biggest day in the company's history. The Cambial family had just sold their tech empire for $3.8 billion. At the center of the celebration sat 27-year-old Zanil Cambial, quiet and almost invisible in her chair. While everyone around her celebrated loudly, she simply watched. Her father stood proudly at the front of the room, smiling as reporters recorded every word. "Today our family celebrates years of hard work," he said confidently. The investors applauded. Zanil expected the speech to end there. But then her father said something that froze the entire room. "There is one more announcement," he continued. "Starting today, Zanil Cambial will no longer be part of Cambial Systems." For a second, the room went completely silent. Her father continued speaking as if it was nothing. "She has never really contributed anything important to this company." The words felt like a knife in Zanil's chest. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. Her own parents were erasing her in front of the entire world. Across the table, her younger brother Sibusiso leaned back in his chair with a small, satisfied smile. Some investors whispered. Others looked uncomfortable. But no one spoke for her. A security guard soon walked toward her. "Miss, you need to leave." Slowly, Zanil stood up while dozens of cameras continued flashing. She walked out of the building that carried her own family name, trying not to show the pain in her eyes. What everyone in that room forgot was one simple truth. The technology that made Cambial Systems worth billions had been built quietly late at night by the very person they had just thrown away. Zanil Cambial. Years before the billion-dollar sale, life inside Cambial Systems looked very different. The company was still growing, and their office in Makola Town was small and busy. Zanil Cambial was already known by the engineers as the quiet genius of the company. She rarely spoke in meetings and never cared about attention. While her parents traveled to meet investors and give interviews, Zanil stayed behind with her laptop, working late into the night. Most nights the office lights were off except for one desk in the corner. Zanil would sit there for hours writing lines of code, testing systems, and fixing problems no one else even understood. Slowly, piece by piece, she created something powerful, a revolutionary artificial intelligence system she called Orion Core. First, it was just an idea she was experimenting with. But as the months passed, Orion Core began doing things no other system could do. It analyzed markets, predicted business trends, and automated complex data systems. Investors were amazed by how fast Cambial Systems was growing, but they never knew the real reason behind it. Behind every success was Zanil's software quietly running in the background. While she built the technology, her parents focused on publicity. They appeared on television interviews and business panels, proudly calling themselves the visionaries behind the company. Whenever reporters asked about the technology, they spoke confidently as if they had created it themselves. Zanil never interrupted them. She simply stayed silent and continued working. Deep down, she didn't care about fame. She only cared about building something great. But there was one decision she made very carefully. Years earlier, when Orion Core was still in development, Zanil had registered the software under a private developer license with her own name on it. She did it quietly, almost like a small form of protection. At the time, it didn't feel like an important step. Now it was, because when the Cambial family proudly announced they were selling the company for $3.8 billion, they believed they owned every part of it. They celebrated as if everything belonged to them. What none of them realized was that the most valuable piece of technology in the entire company, the powerful engine called Orion Core, legally belonged to the quiet daughter they had just thrown away. The news spread across Nambara province within hours. Every major news channel and website was talking about the same story. Cambial family sells tech empire for $3.8 billion. Pictures of Zanil's parents smiling beside powerful investors filled the internet. People praised the Cambial family for building one of the fastest-growing tech companies in Africa. But inside the celebration hall, the reality felt very different for Zanil. Music played softly in the background while waiters walked around with drinks. Investors laughed and congratulated her parents. Everyone was celebrating the success of Cambial Systems. Zanil stood quietly near the back of the room, feeling like a stranger in the company she had helped build. Then her younger brother Sibusiso walked toward a group of investors who were asking about the family. He noticed Zanil standing nearby and suddenly laughed. "Oh, her! he said loudly, pointing toward her. "Don't worry about her. She was just a useless employee who worked around the office." Some guests laughed awkwardly. Others looked uncomfortable but said nothing. Zanil felt the words hit her like a slap. She stared at the floor, trying to control the pain rising in her chest. What hurt even more was when she looked toward her mother. Her mother was standing only a few steps away, talking with reporters, but she acted as if Zanil didn't exist. She didn't defend her. She didn't even look in her direction. It was as if Zanil had suddenly become invisible. Moments later, the security guard approached and politely asked her to leave the building. Slowly, Zanil walked out of the large glass doors of the headquarters. The evening air outside was hot and heavy. Reporters were gathered near the entrance, excited to interview the Campbell family. But when Zanil walked past them, no one stopped her. No one asked her a single question. Cameras continued flashing behind her as journalists rushed inside to speak with her parents instead. Standing alone on the sidewalk, Zanil looked back once at the building carrying her family's name. To everyone watching the news that night, it looked like the story was simple. The powerful Campbell family had won, and the quiet daughter they pushed out had lost everything. That night, instead of going back to the celebration hall or calling anyone, Zanil quietly returned to her small apartment in Kintaba City. The building was old and simple, nothing like the luxury offices her family now owned. The hallway lights flickered as she walked to her door. Inside, the apartment was silent. No celebration. No congratulations. Just a small table, a couch, and her laptop sitting exactly where she had left it that morning. She placed her bag down slowly and sat in the chair. For a few moments she didn't move. Her mind kept replaying everything that had happened in the conference room. Her father's cold voice, her brother's mocking laugh, the way her mother pretended she didn't exist. Zanil took a deep breath and finally opened her laptop. The screen lit up the dark room. She typed a few commands and logged into a secure developer system that only a few people in the world even knew existed. Within seconds, lines of code began appearing on the screen. Data streams, server connections, and system activity reports started loading. It was Orion Core. The powerful artificial intelligence system she had built over the years was still running smoothly across the company's entire network. Every server of the newly sold company was connected to it. Trading systems, financial predictions, automated analysis, everything depended on Orion Core. The billionaire investors celebrating tonight believed they had bought a perfect machine, a flawless system that would run their new empire. But Zanil knew something they didn't. Every system they were now depending on was quietly connected to one thing: her private developer license. She leaned back slightly in her chair and watched the numbers moving across the screen. Thousands of operations were happening every second. Orion Core was doing exactly what it had always done, running the entire company. Without it, nothing would work. Without the license key connected to her account, the system could stop responding. Servers would freeze. Data centers would fail. The powerful empire they had just sold for billions could fall into chaos within hours. Zanil slowly folded her arms and stared at the glowing screen in the dark room. She remembered every moment her family had dismissed her. Every meeting where her ideas were ignored. Every time her parents took credit for something she had built. And now, the final humiliation, being called useless in front of the entire world. Outside, the city of Kintaba continued moving like any normal night. Cars passed on the streets. People laughed in nearby restaurants. But inside the quiet apartment, Zanil sat calmly in front of the system that secretly controlled a billion-dollar empire. For the first time that day, a small, quiet realization settled in her mind. They believed they had erased her. But the storm they had created hadn't even begun yet. 2 days after the huge celebration, everything started falling apart. Inside the luxurious headquarters that the billionaire investors had just bought, engineers suddenly noticed something strange. One of the trading systems stopped responding. First, they thought it was just a small technical problem. These things happen sometimes in big companies. But within minutes, more systems began freezing. Data screens started showing errors. Automated reports stopped updating. The artificial intelligence that usually predicted market changes went completely silent. Employees looked at their monitors in confusion. "Why is Orion Core not responding?" one engineer asked. Another tried restarting the system, but it didn't work. Soon, the entire control floor of the company turned into chaos. Phones were ringing non-stop. Engineers rushed between servers, typing commands as fast as they could. The powerful technology that had made the company famous was suddenly acting like it had lost its brain. Then the data centers began crashing one after another. Huge screens in the control room showed warning messages. Red alerts flashed across the system. The artificial intelligence that normally managed everything had stopped working completely. Panic spread quickly. The billionaire investors who had proudly celebrated the $3.8 billion deal were suddenly furious. They demanded immediate answers. Within hours, they called the Campbell family. "What is happening to the system?" one investor shouted over the phone. "You told us everything was stable." Zanil's father tried to sound confident, but even he didn't understand what was happening. He quickly called the company's engineers, demanding an explanation. The engineers worked for hours trying to find the cause of the problem. They searched through system logs, server records, and security files. Then one young engineer noticed something strange inside the developer settings. The core system license was not owned by the company. It was registered under a private developer account. The engineer opened the license file and read the name slowly. Zanil Campbell. The room went completely quiet. More engineers checked the records to confirm it. The deeper they looked, the clearer the truth became. Orion Core, the powerful artificial intelligence running the entire company, was not owned by Campbell Systems at all. It legally belonged to the person who created it. And that person was the same woman who had been thrown out of the company just 2 days earlier. Without her approval, the license could not be activated. Without the license, the system would keep failing. And without Orion Core, the billion-dollar company the investors had just bought was almost useless. When the engineers finally explained the situation, the room went completely silent. Zanil's father sat at the long conference table, staring at them as if he had heard something impossible. One of the senior engineers repeated the words slowly so there would be no misunderstanding. "Sir, the Orion Core system is registered under a private developer license. The owner of that license is Zanil Campbell." For a moment no one spoke. Then the color slowly drained from his face. Just 2 days earlier, he had proudly stood in front of cameras and told the world that his daughter had never contributed anything important to the company. He had fired her in front of investors, reporters, and employees. And now the engineers were telling him something terrifying. The entire company, the technology that made it worth billions, was controlled by the same daughter he had humiliated and thrown away. His hands trembled slightly as he asked, "Are you saying the system belongs to her?" One engineer nodded carefully. "Yes, sir. Without her developer license, Orion Core cannot operate fully. Legally, the software is her intellectual property." Across the table, Sibusiso suddenly stood up in panic. "This is ridiculous," he snapped, pulling out his phone. "I'll just call her and fix this." He dialed Zanil's number quickly and held the phone to his ear. The call rang and rang. Then it went straight to voicemail. He tried again. No answer. He sent messages. "Zanil, pick up the phone. We need to talk. This is important." But every message stayed unread. Meanwhile, the pressure from the investors was getting worse by the hour. Billionaires who had proudly signed the deal just days earlier were now furious. Their expensive trading systems were failing. Their data centers were unstable. The company they had just bought was losing money every minute. Lawyers began calling the Campbell family. "If this problem isn't fixed immediately," one investor warned coldly, "we will file lawsuits worth billions." Suddenly the confident and powerful Campbell family didn't look powerful anymore. Inside their luxurious office, the atmosphere had completely changed. The same people who had laughed and celebrated days earlier now looked tense and afraid. Because the truth was now painfully clear. The daughter they had called useless, the daughter they had humiliated in front of the entire world, was the only person who could save them. Late that night, the quiet streets of Zuriko Heights were almost empty. Most people inside the apartment buildings were asleep. The streetlights glowed softly, and the neighborhood looked peaceful. Then 3 expensive black cars slowly turned into the narrow street and stopped in front of a small old apartment building. The engines turned off, but no one stepped out immediately. Inside the first car sat Zanil's father, staring up at the building with a tight expression on his face. Just days earlier he had stood proudly in front of cameras, announcing that his daughter was useless to the company. Now he had come to her door. In the second car, Her brother Sibusiso looked restless and irritated. He checked his phone again, hoping to see a reply from Zanil. There was still nothing. Finally, the doors of the cars opened. Zanil's parents and Sibusiso stepped out slowly. Their expensive suits looked strange in front of the simple apartment building. A few lights were still on in nearby windows, and some neighbors quietly watched from their balconies, curious about the luxury cars. They walked toward the entrance of the building. No reporters, no cameras, no celebration this time. Only silence. Inside, they climbed the narrow staircase until they reached Zanil's small apartment door. For a moment, none of them knocked. The situation felt almost unbelievable. Just 2 days earlier they had removed her from the company like she meant nothing. Now they were standing outside her door, hoping she would even speak to them. Finally, her father raised his hand and knocked. The sound echoed softly in the hallway. A few seconds passed. Then the door opened. Zanil stood there calmly, wearing simple clothes, her expression quiet but steady. She looked at the 3 people standing in front of her. Her father, her mother, and her brother. The same family who had humiliated her in front of the world. For a moment no one spoke. Her father cleared his throat awkwardly. "Zanil, we need to talk." She didn't look surprised. In fact, she looked almost as if she had been expecting them. She stepped slightly aside and said calmly, "Come in." As they walked into the small apartment, the powerful Cambiel family suddenly felt something they had never felt before. Nervous. Because standing in that quiet room was no longer the daughter they had mocked and pushed aside. The quiet girl they once ignored now held the power to decide the future of their entire billion-dollar empire. Inside the small apartment, the atmosphere felt tense and uncomfortable. Zanil's parents and Sibusiso looked around the simple living room. There was no luxury furniture, no assistants, no expensive decorations. Just a small table, a couch, and Zanil's laptop sitting quietly on the desk. For a moment, no one knew how to begin the conversation. Finally, Zanil walked to the table and sat down calmly. She opened her laptop while her family watched in silence. The soft light from the screen filled the room. Her father tried to sound confident. "Zanil, the company is having some technical problems," he said carefully. "Our engineers say the Orion system needs your help." Zanil looked at him quietly for a second. "Technical problems?" she repeated softly. She typed a few commands on the laptop and turned the screen slightly so they could see it. Several files opened on the display. "This," she said calmly, "is the original developer contract for Orion Core." Her father stepped closer to read it. Sibusiso leaned forward as well. At the top of the document was a simple line that made the room feel even colder. Developer and owner, Zanil Cambiel. Her name appeared again and again throughout the contract, on every page, every section, every legal signature. Her mother frowned in confusion. "What is this supposed to mean?" she asked. Zanil looked at them steadily. "It means Orion Core belongs to me," she said. The words landed heavily in the quiet room. She continued speaking in the same calm voice. "Years ago, when I was building the system, I registered the software under my personal developer license. That license was never transferred to Cambiel Systems." Her father's expression slowly changed from confusion to shock. "That's impossible," he said quietly. Zanil gently shook her head. "No," she replied. "It's completely legal." She opened another file showing the official registration records. Every document confirmed the same thing. Orion Core had one legal owner. Her. "The company you sold for $3.8 billion, she continued, included offices, staff, servers, and contracts. But the most important technology, the system that runs everything, was never part of that sale." Silence filled the room. Then Zanil said the sentence that made everything painfully clear. "You sold the company," she said calmly, "but you didn't sell its engine." Her father slowly sank into the chair across from her, staring at the screen. For the first time he fully understood the situation. In his arrogance, he had proudly sold a billion-dollar company to investors, without realizing the most valuable part of it had never belonged to him in the first place. The next morning the situation changed completely. Word had already spread among the billionaire investors that the Orion Core system belonged to Zanil. Their lawyers quickly checked the legal documents, and within hours the truth became clear. Everything the engineers had discovered was correct. The powerful artificial intelligence that ran the entire company was legally owned by one person, Zanil Cambiel. Soon her phone started ringing. At first it was unknown numbers, then official business lines, then messages from lawyers and company representatives. The same investors who had ignored her a few days earlier were now asking to speak with her directly. That afternoon, Zanil sat at the small table in her apartment with her laptop open while several investors joined a video call. On the screen were serious faces, wealthy businessmen who had just spent billions buying a company that suddenly could not function. One of them spoke first. "Miss Campbell, we understand that Orion Core is your intellectual property," he said carefully. "We would like to discuss a solution." Zanil listened quietly. Just days earlier she had been thrown out of the company like she meant nothing. Now the most powerful investors in the industry were speaking to her with respect, but she had no interest in begging for her old position. Instead she spoke calmly. "If you want Orion Core to continue running your systems, we need a new agreement." The investors leaned forward. "What kind of agreement?" one asked. Zanil explained clearly. Orion Core was no longer just software for one company. It had the potential to run financial systems, logistics networks, and data platforms across multiple major cities. If they wanted access to the technology, she would become a major partner in the entire network. She proposed a new deal that would expand the system across several growing African tech hubs including Rovuma, Colombo, and Medora. The investors exchanged looks. It was a bold proposal, but they also understood the reality. Without Orion Core, their billion-dollar purchase would continue collapsing. After hours of negotiation, the agreement was finalized. Zanil would keep full ownership of Orion Core. In addition, she would receive a large share in the new technology network that would expand across multiple cities. The deal instantly made her one of the most powerful figures in the entire project. By the time the meeting ended, the situation had completely reversed. The daughter who had been called useless only days earlier had now become the most important person in the entire billion-dollar system. And without raising her voice, without begging anyone, Zanil Campbell had just secured more power and wealth than anyone in her family had ever imagined. Months passed, and the story that once shocked people in Nambara province slowly turned into one of the biggest business stories across Africa. News channels began showing a very different headline. Zanil Campbell becomes young tech queen after billion-dollar deal. Her photo appeared on television screens, business magazines, and online news articles. Journalists talked about how the quiet developer who had been pushed out of her own family company had become the most important figure behind one of the fastest-growing technology networks in the region. Across cities like Rovuma, Colombo, and Medora, companies were now using the Orion Core system that Zanil owned. The technology was helping businesses predict markets, manage data, and run complex financial systems. Investors who once ignored her were now praising her as a brilliant innovator. In interviews, reporters asked her how she felt about everything that had happened. Zanil usually answered calmly. "I just focused on building good technology," she would say with a small smile. Meanwhile, inside the large Campbell family house, the atmosphere felt very different. One evening, Zanil's parents sat in their living room watching the news. On the television screen, reporters were talking about her success again. Footage showed her speaking at a technology conference, while a crowd of investors listened carefully. Her father stared at the screen without saying a word. Only months earlier, he had stood proudly in front of cameras and told the world that his daughter had never contributed anything important. Now the entire industry knew the truth. The company he had sold for billions had only been valuable because of the technology she created. Beside him, Sibu Siso quietly turned off the television. No one in the room spoke. They all understood the painful reality. They had fired the one person who truly built their empire. They had humiliated the daughter who was actually the brain behind everything. And now the world knew her name. The girl they once called useless had become one of the most powerful names in the tech industry. But the biggest difference this time was simple. The empire she was building no longer belonged to the Campbell family. It belonged only to Zanil Campbell.